Isaac Johnson stood in the spacious corner office of Johnson Enterprises, gazing out the window at the skyline. The sprawling city below symbolized progress, ambition, and success, the same values that had fueled him over the past 2 decades to build this company from the ground up. It was his pride, a legacy that bore his name and values. Yet, today, none of it felt quite right. For months, whispers and uneasy glances had surfaced in employee feedback reports. The company's HR surveys spoke in code, terms like workplace tension, disconnect, and inconsistent treatment threaded the pages, interspersed with vague references to favoritism and veiled prejudice. But these weren't just words to Isaac, they were warning signs. Hints that the very culture he dreamed of was slipping away, twisted into something unrecognizable. There had been one report that troubled him most of all. A young intern had detailed an incident involving a senior manager who mocked and dismissed her work in front of others, simply because she dared to share her perspective. She hadn't filed a formal complaint. Instead, she simply quit, feeling that her place in the company was beneath her dignity. Isaac had tried to brush it off. Johnson Enterprises was massive now, with thousands of employees in branches across the country. Surely, he couldn't be held responsible for every single interaction. But the reports persisted, tugging at his thoughts in quiet moments, gnawing at his conscience. The company that bore his name had become a place where discrimination and disrespect hid in plain sight. And that he could not tolerate. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, Isaac decided he'd had enough. He couldn't keep reading reports from his desk or relying on secondhand accounts. He needed to see it, feel it, breathe it in for himself. He needed to find out whether his instincts were right, that the heart of Johnson Enterprises had somehow drifted into dangerous waters. A plan started to form in his mind, bold and unconventional. He would go undercover, disguising himself to witness firsthand how people treated one another within his own walls. The idea was both thrilling and unnerving. He'd spent years wearing tailored suits, his presence signaling authority wherever he went. Now, he'd step into the shoes of those overlooked, blending into the shadows and observing the company he'd worked so hard to build. The morning of his plan's execution dawned gray and quiet. Isaac slipped into his disguise, a dark blue security uniform, stiff, practical shoes, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Gone was the polished executive image. In its place was a man no one would look twice at, a silent figure meant to blend in and observe. As he stepped out of his sleek car and entered the bustling headquarters, the difference in people's reactions hit him instantly. There were no greetings, no friendly nods or smiles. People walked past him as if he were invisible, mere background noise in the symphony of corporate life. In the lobby, he found a vantage point by a potted plant, standing watch as streams of employees hurried to start their day. In the first few minutes, his heart sank. An arrogant man with a crisp suit and self-assured gait swept past him without a glance. The name on his ID badge read David Walker. As Walker neared a black female cleaner mopping the floor, he deliberately placed a foot on the freshly cleaned spot, leaving a scuff of dirt behind. Then, without a trace of remorse, he turned to the woman with an icy smile. "You should wipe it again, this place is still dirty," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. The woman bowed her head and murmured an apology. Despite having done her work meticulously, Isaac clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay silent, to remain the invisible observer he had set out to be. Hours passed, each interaction more troubling than the last. Executives barely looked at him. They talked down to receptionists, dismissed janitors, and treated assistants as if they were inconveniences rather than essential parts of the team. He watched as Thomas Lee, the finance director, glared at him when their paths crossed. Lee's eyes flicked up and down, assessing him with cold scrutiny. "Just do your job. Keep things tidy," Lee said stiffly, his gaze hard and unyielding. Then, as Isaac reached down to pick up a stray water bottle that had rolled his way, Lee kicked it further, the bottle skittering across the floor. "Pick it up," he demanded mockingly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Isaac looked at the bottle, his blood pounding, but he didn't react. Instead,
He bent down.
picked it up, and straightened, nodding politely, swallowing the fury welling up within him. Lee chuckled, clearly satisfied, and strode away, leaving Isaac alone with a resentment that burned hotter with each passing second. The day crawled by, each instance of casual cruelty pressing against his patience like a weight he could barely carry. By evening, Isaac's mind was made up. He had seen enough. The rumors were true. The culture within Johnson Enterprises was more toxic than he had dared to imagine. And if he didn't act now, this company, his company, would lose everything it stood for. Isaac Johnson returned home that night with a new mission. Tomorrow, he would make sure every single person in his company understood what respect and dignity meant. He would remind them, whether they liked it or not, that every role mattered, every person counted, and no one was beneath another. Tomorrow, he would reveal himself. And tomorrow, Johnson Enterprises would begin its transformation. Isaac arrived early the next morning, donning the same dark blue security uniform that had allowed him to move unseen through his own company's halls. This time, he was determined to watch every corner, every interaction, and take in the unfiltered reality of Johnson Enterprises. As the building began to fill with employees, he stationed himself by the main lobby's glass doors, pretending to check IDs and occasionally nodding at those who walked in. Yet, just like the day before, not a single person acknowledged him, not even a polite glance. To them, he was nothing more than part of the furniture. But Isaac's anonymity was exactly what he needed. He observed in silence, feeling like a ghost drifting through the corridors of his own empire, powerless but all-seeing. It wasn't long before he spotted David Walker, the same marketing executive from yesterday. Walker entered with the same air of superiority, his suit impeccable, his stride confident. As he passed by Isaac, he didn't so much as pause, heading directly toward the lobby where a young receptionist, Marissa, was organizing some files. Isaac watched closely as Walker approached her. She straightened, a nervous smile crossing her face, but Walker barely acknowledged her. "Coffee. Black. And don't take all day," he barked, dismissing her with a wave before she could even respond. Marissa nodded, hurrying off, her steps quick and obedient. Walker stood, tapping his foot impatiently, already scrolling through his phone. Isaac felt the tension coil in his stomach.
He wanted to call Walker out right then, to show him what a true leader looked like.
But he held back. Today was about watching, gathering, and letting each moment reveal the depth of his company's problems. Moments later, Thomas Lee strolled into the lobby, carrying the same smug demeanor Isaac remembered from yesterday. Lee was in the middle of a phone call, his voice cutting through the quiet space as he marched past Isaac without even a glance. "Tell them we're not paying more. If they don't like it, they can find another vendor," Lee said into his phone, his tone sharp and dismissive. When he ended the call, he looked around, his gaze landing on a janitor mopping a section of the floor.
"Hey,
careful there," Lee sneered, pointing to a streak of water that had barely missed his polished shoes. The janitor, a man perhaps in his 60s with tired eyes, quickly wiped at the spot, his shoulders slumping as he muttered an apology. Isaac's anger simmered beneath his calm expression. He knew the janitor. His name was Carl, and he'd been with Johnson Enterprises since its early days. Back then, when the team was small and Isaac was building his dream, Carl had been one of the quiet yet steadfast faces keeping the space clean through long nights.
Now,
to watch his old friend be degraded as though he was disposable, Isaac felt a flash of regret. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost touch with these people, and he was paying the price now. Hours passed, each one filled with similar scenes. Isaac saw executives laugh among themselves, mocking others in lower positions. He watched as assistants were ignored, as lower-level employees scurried out of the way, heads down, afraid to speak up. But what unsettled Isaac the most was the silent complicity. He noticed how people looked away, how they avoided eye contact when they saw someone mistreated, how they sidestepped conflict out of fear of retribution. No one spoke up, and no one dared to challenge the status quo. By the afternoon, Isaac decided to shift his disguise. He returned to his office, where a red delivery uniform waited for him, neatly folded in the corner. As he changed, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The face staring back was different from the one he knew. The confidence, the strength, it was still there. But today it was hidden behind a facade of humility and resilience. This was the face of someone invisible, a person his employees believed they could dismiss without consequence. He slipped on the cap, pulled it low, and re-entered the building, this time pushing a cart loaded with documents and files. His destination was the large conference room where the senior management team was holding a meeting. He knew that if there was any place where arrogance would be on full display, it would be here. As he pushed open the door to the conference room, the room fell silent. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. James Parker, the business manager, was the first to break the silence. He looked up, an eyebrow raised, his mouth twisted in an irritated scowl. "What are you doing here?" he snapped, his voice tinged with impatience. Isaac kept his voice steady, polite. "I'm here to deliver the documents, sir." James rolled his eyes, sharing a look of amusement with the others around the table. The other executives chuckled, leaning in and exchanging whispers as though Isaac had just made some absurd mistake. Sarah Williams, the head of HR, gave him a once-over, her gaze lingering just long enough to convey her disdain. "Bring them over here, carefully," Sarah said, her tone cold and dismissive. "People would kill for a job as easy as yours. Do it right." The comment struck Isaac like a slap. She, of all people, should have known better. As the head of HR, she was supposed to ensure a culture of respect and inclusion. Yet here she was, treating him as if his work was beneath her notice. He pushed the cart forward, his hands steady but his heart racing. As he placed the boxes on the table, he could hear the whispers and laughter behind him. James added another jab, smirking as he said, "Not everyone's lucky enough to be a delivery guy." "I'm sure he's thrilled." Isaac fought to keep his composure, each insult sinking deeper than the last. He'd spent years building this company, pouring every ounce of himself into its success. And here were the people he trusted, the ones who represented him, showing nothing but contempt for the roles that helped the company thrive. As he left the room, the laughter still echoed in his ears. He paused for a moment, gripping the handle of the cart tightly as the weight of his realization settled in. Johnson Enterprises wasn't just a company that needed change, it was a company that needed transformation from its very core. Isaac took a steadying breath, a promise solidifying in his mind. Tomorrow, he would return, not as the invisible security guard or the overlooked delivery man. Tomorrow, he would walk in as Isaac Johnson, the man who owned this company, the man who wouldn't stand for the injustices he'd witnessed. And tomorrow, he would bring an end to the toxic culture that had taken root. The morning light cast a hazy glow over Johnson Enterprises as Isaac returned. Once again cloaked in anonymity, he felt like an intruder in his own world, each interaction twisting the knife of betrayal a little deeper. Today, he planned to test how far this culture of contempt extended, to see whether the rot had seeped even into the hidden corners and quieter roles of his company. Isaac took up a spot near the elevator banks, a clipboard in hand, blending in as part of the invisible framework that made the building run. Employees bustled past him, their eyes fixed on screens, coffee cups in hand, moving through the morning rush with purpose. They paid him no mind, treating him like an ornament in the background, a fixture they had grown used to ignoring. Just as he was about to move, he saw a group of interns filing into the elevator across the lobby, chatting excitedly about their latest projects. One of them, a young woman named Lila, was laughing as she recounted a meeting mishap. But her smile faded the moment she stepped onto the elevator and found herself facing Thomas Lee. Isaac watched as Thomas gave her a cold once-over, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This is the senior staff elevator," he snapped, his tone biting. Lila stammered, apologizing, her voice trembling as she tried to explain she hadn't known. "Clearly," Thomas muttered, not even bothering to hide his annoyance. He turned his back to her as she stumbled out of the elevator. Her face flushed, the weight of humiliation etched into her every step. Isaac clenched his jaw, noting the way the other interns averted their gaze, unwilling to come to Lila's defense. A few moments later, Isaac spotted Marissa, the receptionist he had observed the day before, standing behind her desk as an executive named Peter Strum passed by. Peter was a middle-aged man with a steely look in his eyes, a man known for making employees feel small with a single glance. As he reached her desk, Marissa offered him a polite greeting, her tone warm and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Strum. I hope you're having a nice day so far." Peter didn't respond. Instead, he placed his coffee cup on her desk with a faint sneer and turned his gaze toward her. "This is cold," he said, as though she were personally responsible for the state of his coffee. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Marissa staring at the cup, her smile fading as she reached to dispose of it. Isaac felt a pang of regret watching her. How many more employees like Marissa, like Lila, were made to feel lesser every day in this place? He had been so focused on growing Johnson Enterprises, on scaling its reach and impact, that he had failed to see the festering culture of entitlement within its walls. The morning wore on, bringing more glimpses into the harsh hierarchy that had developed within the company. Executives brushed past assistants with barely a nod. Department heads treated junior employees as if their opinions were irrelevant. Isaac witnessed moments of quiet cruelty, each one cutting deeper, confirming the necessity of his plan. Around midday, Isaac switched roles again, returning in the uniform of a building maintenance worker. He went straight to the tech department, hoping to observe interactions in a place he'd once held so dear, back when he was a young entrepreneur dreaming of revolutionizing the industry. As he entered the open-floor workspace, he caught sight of Oliver Green, a senior developer, seated at his desk. Oliver was widely regarded as a rising star, known for his innovative ideas. He was speaking animatedly with a younger colleague when their manager,
Linda Bates,
approached, her expression stiff and dismissive. "Oliver," she said sharply, cutting into their conversation. "Do you have time to chat? I need you to review these documents before the end of the day." She handed him a thick stack of papers, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Oliver glanced down, visibly overwhelmed. "Actually, Linda, I have a lot on my plate today. Could I possibly get these by tomorrow morning?" Linda's face twisted into a thin smile. "If you're too busy for your responsibilities, maybe we should reconsider your position on the team," she replied, her voice low but carrying a weight of warning. Oliver fell silent, his shoulders slumping as he accepted the documents. Linda turned on her heel and left without another word, her authority having silenced him entirely. Isaac's anger was a quiet storm now, building with every new offense he witnessed. Linda was supposed to foster innovation, encourage her team, yet here she was, intimidating her most promising developer with threats veiled as advice. By afternoon, Isaac was weary of the facade, feeling the heavy toll of bearing witness to behavior that had once felt unthinkable in his company. He changed back into his delivery uniform for the last part of the day and returned to the executive floor, pushing a cart of carefully stacked documents. He had barely reached the executive suites when he encountered James Parker again, the business manager whose arrogance had grated on him since yesterday. James spotted Isaac, his lips curling into a familiar smirk as he sauntered over.
"Ah,
"The delivery guy. Looks like you finally found your place," James said, his tone laced with condescension. Isaac forced a polite smile, feeling the weight of his role pressing down on him. "Just doing my job, sir." James laughed, exchanging an amused glance with Sarah Williams, who stood nearby. She raised an eyebrow, looking Isaac up and down as though assessing whether he was worth her time. "Let's hope you can manage that without any mistakes," she quipped. "After all, there are plenty of people who'd love an easy job like yours." The dismissive laughter echoed around him, bouncing off the walls as Isaac's patience began to crack. He was done watching. He was done playing the part. He was done allowing these people to believe they held any power over him or anyone else in this building. Tomorrow, everything would change. As he left the office that night, Isaac felt a calm certainty settle over him. Tomorrow, he would not come as a silent witness. Tomorrow, he would come as Isaac Johnson, the owner of Johnson Enterprises, the man who had built this empire from nothing, and the man who would make sure it no longer bred contempt, arrogance,
or prejudice.
The next morning, Isaac took a deep breath as he slipped into his final disguise, a delivery man uniform, complete with a red cap pulled low over his face. He felt the familiar weight of resolve settling into his chest. Today, he was going to test the people he'd trusted to represent his vision on the biggest stage yet, the executive board meeting. He pushed a cart piled with neatly stacked document boxes and maneuvered it down the gleaming hallways of Johnson Enterprises, making his way toward the conference room. He knew his timing was perfect. The board members would be seated by now, reviewing their reports, preparing for yet another meeting where they discuss profits,
growth,
and projections without ever once considering the human spirit that had built it all. Isaac paused outside the closed doors of the conference room, his hand resting on the handle. He could hear voices inside, the familiar tone of executives discussing business in clipped, detached terms. Steeling himself, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, meeting the curious, irritated stares of the board. The room fell silent. Heads turned toward him, brows furrowing as they took in his delivery uniform and the cart of documents he was wheeling forward. James Parker, the business manager, was seated near the head of the table, his face instantly twisting into a frown. "What are you doing here?" James snapped, his tone already laced with annoyance. Isaac kept his posture respectful and his expression neutral. "I'm here to deliver some documents, sir." A few of the executives exchanged glances, murmuring to each other, and then James let out a loud,
dismissive sigh.
He looked around the room with an exaggerated roll of his eyes, leaning back in his chair as if he couldn't believe he had to deal with something so trivial. "This is a board meeting," James scoffed. "Do you have any idea where you are? Get this done quickly and don't disturb us." Isaac nodded, pushing the cart forward with steady hands. His heart was pounding, but he kept his movements controlled, his expression carefully blank. He stopped near Sarah Williams, the head of HR, who gave him a tight, condescending smile as she motioned for him to place the documents on the table in front of her. "Careful with those," she said, her voice a low hiss as she added, "You wouldn't want to mess this up. Plenty of people would kill for a job as easy as yours." Isaac felt the sting of her words as if she'd slapped him, but he didn't react, continuing to unload the boxes with practiced precision. Around him, the executives whispered and snickered, their voices barely hidden as they cast amused glances in his direction, as though his mere presence was a spectacle meant solely for their entertainment. As he turned to leave, James Parker decided to add one more jab. "Not everyone's lucky enough to be a delivery guy," he said, his tone mocking as he leaned back in his chair, watching Isaac with a smirk. Isaac clenched his jaw, his grip on the cart tightening for a brief second before he steadied himself. He glanced around the room, letting his gaze linger on each of them, and nodded politely. "Have a good day, sir," he replied, his voice calm and steady. James chuckled, clearly amused by what he saw as Isaac's submission. He turned back to his fellow board members, who shared in his laughter, and continued with their meeting as if the delivery man was nothing more than a speck of dust floating through the room. Isaac pushed the cart back out into the hallway, his mind racing. His heart felt like a weight in his chest, the anger bubbling beneath his calm facade. He had seen and heard enough. It wasn't just a few individuals who had become arrogant and dismissive. It was his entire senior management, the very people he had trusted to uphold the values of Johnson Enterprises. Today had been the final straw. He couldn't allow his company to continue like this. Couldn't let these executives believe they were above others simply because of the titles on their business cards. Later that evening, as he shed the delivery uniform and stood in his office, Isaac made a decision. Tomorrow, he would confront them, not as the invisible figure they had mocked, but as Isaac Johnson, the owner and founder of Johnson Enterprises. He would show them that respect was not optional, that their positions didn't grant them the right to demean others. In that moment, he could see clearly what Johnson Enterprises would look like if he allowed this toxic culture to go unchecked, a hollow shell of a company, driven by profit but devoid of empathy. And that was not a legacy he was willing to leave behind. Tomorrow, they would meet Isaac Johnson, not the security guard, not the delivery man, but the leader they had underestimated. And by tomorrow's end, Johnson Enterprises would begin a transformation that would remind every person in the company that respect and dignity were the true cornerstones of success. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Isaac sat alone in his office, the city's lights twinkling far beneath him. Tonight, the familiar view offered no comfort. Instead, it reminded him of the countless faces he had seen and overlooked. Faces now etched in his mind after days of blending into their world. He had become one of them, a figure overlooked and dismissed. And it had opened his eyes to a reality he could no longer ignore. He thought back to his humble beginnings, to the late nights spent working out of his apartment with only a laptop and a dream. Back then, Johnson Enterprises was just an idea, a company where people from all walks of life could work together, respect each other, and thrive on merit alone. But somewhere along the journey from a small startup to a towering corporate empire, that vision had slipped away. And now, the very culture he had fought so hard to create was buried under arrogance, entitlement, and contempt. For the first time, he felt like an outsider in his own company. He had seen a version of Johnson Enterprises that he never imagined possible, a place where respect was reserved for a select few, where kindness was a weakness, and where power was wielded as a weapon. The realization weighed on him, a bitter taste lingering long after the final insult he had witnessed that day. Isaac rose from his chair and began pacing, his mind racing with each step. His instincts had been right. If he allowed this toxic culture to grow, unchecked and unchallenged, it would infect every corner of Johnson Enterprises, reducing it to a place no better than any other soulless corporation. He knew he had to act, and he had to act decisively. Tomorrow, he would reveal himself. But it wouldn't just be a confrontation. It would be the start of a revolution, a deep and painful overhaul of the very culture that had poisoned his company from within. He envisioned the faces of those who had mocked him, the sneer of James Parker, the dismissive smirk of Sarah Williams, the cold condescension of Thomas Lee. Each one had contributed to the twisted hierarchy that had taken root in his company, and each one would be held accountable. Determined, Isaac sat back at his desk, penning an email that would summon every senior executive and board member to a mandatory meeting in the main conference room. The tone was direct, leaving no room for interpretation. Attendance is non-negotiable. The future of Johnson Enterprises depends on it. With the email sent, he leaned back, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. Tomorrow, the people who had belittled and demeaned the very backbone of the company would be forced to reckon with the truth. They would face the consequences of their actions. And they would learn that respect was not just a word tossed around in training seminars. It was the foundation of everything Johnson Enterprises was meant to stand for. In the quiet of the night, Isaac's resolve solidified. His plan would not end with a single meeting or a stern warning. This was going to be a complete transformation, a new era of transparency and accountability. And it would start with the people at the top. He would introduce policies, implement training, and create pathways for every voice within the company to be heard. He would put systems in place to ensure that no one, not a single person, would experience the kind of humiliation and mistreatment he had witnessed. Tomorrow, He wouldn't walk into that boardroom as a leader desperate to regain control. He would walk in as a man with a mission. A man who demanded better, not just for himself, but for every person who called Johnson Enterprises their workplace.
He owed it to them,
to his younger self, and to the dream that had built this company. As he prepared to leave for the night, Isaac cast one final look around his office. Tomorrow, it wouldn't just be a room with a view. It would be a place of purpose, a space where everyone, from the interns to the executives, would have a stake in making Johnson Enterprises a place of respect, fairness, and integrity. And if anyone in that room was unwilling to adapt, they would find that their time at Johnson Enterprises was over. With a deep breath, he left the building, his steps echoing through the empty halls as he walked toward tomorrow's inevitable reckoning. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Johnson Enterprises headquarters was different. An urgent meeting notification had landed in the inboxes of every executive and senior manager, and by 9 a.m., the main conference room was filled with a sense of unease. Whispers and curious glances bounced around the room as people wondered what could possibly require such a mandatory gathering. James Parker sat near the front, a smirk on his face as he leaned back, relaxed and confident. He exchanged a glance with Sarah Williams, the head of HR, who looked equally at ease. Both seemed unfazed, certain that this meeting was nothing more than routine business. Perhaps a briefing on the latest financial report or a motivational speech from the CEO they rarely saw. The clock ticked past 9:05 when, finally, the conference room doors swung open. Isaac Johnson stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed in his usual tailored suit, he looked every bit the leader they were used to seeing in the media. Yet there was something different in his eyes, a steely resolve, a quiet fury that made the room fall into silence. James Parker's smirk faltered as Isaac walked purposefully to the head of the table. Not sparing a glance for anyone, he pulled out the chairman's chair,
sat down,
and looked around, meeting the eyes of each executive one by one. The weight of his gaze settled over them, erasing any trace of smugness from their faces. A murmur rippled through the room, executives exchanging nervous glances, some adjusting their ties, others looking down at their hands. Isaac's silence stretched, filling the room with a tension that thickened with every passing second. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, yet carrying the weight of an unspoken warning. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I'm here," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "After all, it's not often I call for an emergency meeting."
He paused,
watching their faces shift from curiosity to discomfort. "But I felt it was time we had a discussion, a real discussion about what this company has become." James Parker let out a faint chuckle, his confidence returning as he sat up straighter.
"Well,
"I hope we're not here to discuss complaints from the lower floors," he sneered. "We're here to talk strategy. Isaac. Profits. Growth." Isaac's eyes locked onto James, cutting him off with a look that could silence anyone. "Actually,
James,
that's exactly why we're here," Isaac replied, his voice cold. "For too long, this company has been led by people who have mistaken their titles for superiority, who treat others as if they're less than human." A hush fell over the room. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Sarah Williams glanced at James, her brow furrowing. Isaac's words hit them with a force none of them had anticipated. "Yesterday, I was here," Isaac continued, leaning forward, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that demanded their attention. "I was here as a security guard, as a delivery man.
I saw, firsthand,
the way you all treat the people who work in this building, the people who make this company possible. And what I saw disgusted me." James paled, his smirk completely gone now as realization dawned. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Around him, the other executives stared, eyes wide as they processed Isaac's revelation. He had been there, among them, disguised as the very people they'd treated with contempt. Isaac's gaze settled on Sarah, who was staring at him, her mouth slightly open in shock. I heard you dismissing someone's work as beneath them, he said, his voice unyielding. I saw you,
Sarah.
mocking the delivery guy, me, and calling the job easy. And James, he added, turning to the business manager, who looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. I saw you laughing, treating me as if I were some joke. Nothing more than a nuisance in your day. The color drained from James's face, and his eyes darted around the room, as if searching for support. But no one spoke up. They were all watching Isaac, their expressions shifting between shock,
Guilt.
and growing fear. You've all forgotten what it means to lead, Isaac continued, his voice growing stronger. Somewhere along the way, you started believing that your titles give you the right to belittle others,
To treat people as if their work,
their time, their dignity doesn't matter. But let me make this very clear. In this company, that will no longer stand. Isaac's words hung in the air, thick with the promise of change. He watched as each executive, each senior manager, processed the gravity of his statement. This was not a warning, it was a decree. From this day forward, he said, his tone resolute, Johnson Enterprises will become a company where respect is non-negotiable, where every employee, from the interns to the senior managers, is treated with the dignity they deserve. If any of you believe you are above this, if any of you think you can continue as you have, you are free to leave. Because if you don't change, I will personally see to it that you no longer have a place here. The room remained silent, the tension almost unbearable as Isaac's words settled over them. He let his gaze linger on each of them, ensuring they understood the gravity of the moment. This was no longer about profit margins or market share. It was about something far deeper, something that defined the very core of who they were as a company.
Slowly,
Isaac rose from his chair, his voice unwavering as he delivered his final words. I built this company on respect, integrity, and the belief that every role is valuable.
And from this day on,
That's what Johnson Enterprises will stand for. We will become a place where people want to work, not out of fear or obligation, but because they know they'll be treated with fairness and respect. With one last glance around the room, Isaac turned and walked out, leaving behind a conference room full of stunned, silent executives. In that moment, they knew the world of Johnson Enterprises had changed. And for the first time in years, that change had come from the very top. As the door closed behind him, Isaac felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had taken the first step, but he knew the road ahead would be long. Yet as he walked down the hallway, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Johnson Enterprises would be reborn, and this time, it would be built on a foundation of respect, integrity, and true leadership. The air in Johnson Enterprises felt different. The ripple effect of Isaac's powerful confrontation at the board meeting was spreading through every floor, every department, reaching employees who had only heard whispers of what had taken place. By the next morning, the executives, who had once commanded with arrogance and entitlement, moved through the building with a tense, subdued demeanor. Isaac, however, was more focused than ever. He spent the morning with his sleeves rolled up, meeting with his HR and operations teams to map out the fundamental changes he'd envisioned. It would be more than just a shift in policies, it would be a complete transformation of the culture at Johnson Enterprises.
from the top down,
The first step was transparency. Isaac called for a series of meetings open to all employees, a chance for them to voice their concerns
share their stories,
and help shape the changes he planned to implement. These meetings would be led by the new cultural board he'd set up, a diverse group of employees across all levels, chosen for their integrity, empathy, and commitment to the company's values. Isaac could sense the skepticism in the room during the first of these meetings. Employees shuffled in quietly, some sitting with arms crossed, others casting wary glances around the room. These were people who had learned to stay silent, who had watched disrespect become routine, who had seen kindness and honesty fall prey to power plays and intimidation. But today, they saw Isaac himself standing before them, a mix of hope and determination in his eyes. Thank you for being here, Isaac began, his voice calm yet resolute. I know you've all been through a lot. Some of you may have felt invisible, overlooked, or even mistreated. I want you to know that today marks the beginning of a new era for Johnson Enterprises. We are here to listen, to understand, and to change. He paused, meeting the eyes of those around him, feeling the weight of their expectations. We are creating a board that will represent each of you, he continued. A team devoted to ensuring fairness, respect, and equal opportunity for every employee, regardless of their title or position. And this board will report directly to me. There was a silence as his words settled.
Then, slowly,
A hand raised from the back of the room. It was Carl, the janitor Isaac had seen demeaned by Thomas Lee just days earlier. Carl's face showed traces of hope and hesitation, his voice steady but cautious. Mr. Johnson, he said, how can we be sure things will really change this time? Isaac nodded, respecting the weight of Carl's question. I understand your doubts,
Carl.
and you have every right to feel that way. But I am not just asking for change, I am enforcing it. We are revising the company's code of conduct, and we are implementing training across all levels to foster a culture of respect and accountability. And let me be clear, anyone who fails to adhere to these new standards will not have a place here. Around the room, employees exchanged glances, a spark of optimism flickering in their expressions. Isaac knew that trust wouldn't be rebuilt in a day, but he was prepared to earn it. He was willing to do whatever it took to prove to his employees that this time, things would be different. Over the next few weeks, Isaac worked tirelessly. He personally oversaw the new initiatives, from empathy training for senior management to mentorship programs for junior staff. A new anonymous feedback system was introduced, allowing employees to report mistreatment without fear of retaliation. The changes were immediate and drastic, and Isaac could feel the shift as employees began to walk through the halls with a newfound sense of purpose and pride. In one of the follow-up meetings, James Parker, who had previously been one of the company's most entitled and unkind executives, sat near the front. He looked humbled, a shadow of his former self. Isaac noticed him there, leaning forward, attentively listening as an intern spoke about her experiences with disrespect from senior staff. When the intern finished speaking, James raised his hand, a hesitant look in his eyes. I'd like to apologize, he said, his voice quiet, uncharacteristically genuine, for my actions, my words, and for not understanding the damage I was causing. I have a lot to learn, but I'm willing to change. Isaac watched, feeling a surge of hope. James's words, however small, were a symbol of the transformation taking root in the company. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and it was coming from within. As the days passed, more stories emerged of employees standing up for one another, of managers offering mentorship, and of junior staff finding their voices in ways they had never dared before. Johnson Enterprises was evolving, no longer a hierarchy of power but a community of respect. Isaac walked through the halls one afternoon, watching employees chat freely, share ideas openly, and support one another in ways he hadn't seen in years. A group of executives passed by, greeting him not with the usual detached nod but with genuine smiles, a shared respect that transcended title or rank. Standing by the window, Isaac felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. Johnson Enterprises was finally becoming what he had always dreamed it could be, a place where every person, no matter their role, was valued and respected. He knew the journey wasn't over. Challenges would come, and maintaining this new culture would require constant vigilance and commitment. But he was ready. With a final glance over his transformed company, he allowed himself a smile. He had reclaimed the heart of Johnson Enterprises, and he knew that together, they were building a legacy worth remembering. The weeks following the transformation were nothing short of remarkable. As word spread through the corporate world, Johnson Enterprises gained attention, not for its profits or growth projections, but for its radical shift in culture. Media outlets began reaching out, curious about the company that had managed to turn its reputation on its head. Employees shared their stories, talking about a workplace that had become a source of pride rather than fear. The very walls of Johnson Enterprises seemed to carry the echoes of renewed respect and purpose. Isaac watched these changes unfold with a quiet satisfaction. But he knew this was just the beginning. He had seen companies lose their way before, slipping back into old habits once the initial fervor wore off. That would not happen here, not as long as he was at the helm. The board meeting that had once been a chamber of disdain and elitism was now a place of genuine exchange, where every voice carried weight and respect. Isaac sat at the head of the table, his presence less a symbol of authority than of accountability, a reminder to everyone present of what Johnson Enterprises now stood for. Across from him sat Carl, the janitor who had witnessed years of silent disregard and now served as a permanent member of the company's new cultural board. His inclusion was more than symbolic. It was proof that every role mattered and that every voice had the right to be heard. Carl was nervous at first, but his insight quickly proved invaluable, providing a perspective on daily life at Johnson Enterprises that few executives had ever considered. Beside Carl sat Marissa, the receptionist who had once been ignored and dismissed, now working as a diversity and inclusion officer. Her role involved ensuring that hiring practices reflected the company's values, helping bring in employees who would uphold the newfound culture of respect.
She spoke with confidence now,
Her voice clear and assured as she described the progress of her team's latest initiatives. As Isaac looked around the table, he noticed a subtle, almost unrecognizable change in James Parker. Once brimming with arrogance, James had undergone a profound shift. He now approached his role with humility, volunteering for mentorship programs and attending empathy workshops without complaint. He had become a mentor for junior employees, guiding them with patience and a newfound respect. To Isaac's surprise, James had even apologized to those he'd mistreated, his remorse as genuine as his commitment to change. When it was his turn to speak, James cleared his throat, his eyes meeting Isaac's across the table. "I want to thank everyone here for allowing me a chance to make amends," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "This transformation, it's changed me in ways I never thought possible. I used to think power was about control, about proving myself.
but now,
I understand that true leadership is about respect." A wave of warmth spread through the room, each person nodding in silent agreement. They had all been part of a metamorphosis, not only for Johnson Enterprises but for themselves as individuals. The company was becoming something more, a family, a place where each person knew they were valued. The next day, Isaac was invited to speak at a national leadership conference. He hadn't planned on sharing Johnson Enterprises' journey publicly, but he knew their story had the power to inspire a wider change. Standing on stage, looking out at an audience filled with industry leaders, he began to tell the story of a company once lost in arrogance and entitlement, a company that had to tear down its walls of hierarchy to rebuild something stronger. "When I founded Johnson Enterprises, I dreamed of a company built on respect, on fairness, on recognizing the value of every role, no matter how big or small," Isaac told the crowd. "Somewhere along the way, we lost that vision. But the people at Johnson Enterprises reminded me what true leadership is. It's about creating a place where everyone has a voice, where every job is essential, and where respect is the foundation." The audience listened, captivated by his story. Isaac could see the impact in their faces, in the way they leaned forward, inspired by the power of what he was describing. "In a world focused on profit and growth," he concluded, "we sometimes forget what really matters. The true success of a company isn't measured by the bottom line. It's measured by the impact it has on the lives of the people who make it thrive. If we create workplaces rooted in dignity, fairness, and respect, we build something far more enduring." As Isaac stepped off the stage, he was met with applause. But it wasn't the accolades that filled him with pride. It was the knowledge that his message resonated, that Johnson Enterprises had become a beacon of what a company could be, a place where every person mattered. Back at the office, Isaac took a quiet moment to reflect. His journey as a leader had transformed him, just as it had transformed his employees. Johnson Enterprises was no longer just a company. It was a community, a place where people felt empowered to bring their best selves to work, knowing they were valued, respected, and heard. Isaac returned to his desk, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known before. He glanced at the small plaque on his desk, a reminder of his company's new mission: respect, integrity, and unity. It wasn't just a motto, it was the new heart of Johnson Enterprises. As he looked out at his bustling team below, Isaac smiled. The transformation was real, and it was just the beginning.